There's a specific moment when the avoidant realizes you're not coming back, when the possibility of reconciliation shifts from theoretical to impossible, when they understand that the door they assumed would always remain open has closed permanently. This moment doesn't always arrive when you end the relationship. The avoidant has experienced breakups before, has watched people leave, has been told it's over. But those endings felt temporary because the person who left was still emotionally invested, still hurt, still hoping the avoidant would change. The moment that breaks the avoidant differently is when they recognize you've moved beyond hurt into genuine indifference, when they see evidence that you're not just living without them, but thriving without them, when they understand that you're not waiting or hoping or leaving space for their return. This recognition doesn't come all at once. It builds through accumulating evidence. You don't respond to their breadcrumbs. You seem genuinely happy in ways you never were during the relationship. You've built a life so full that there's no obvious room for them anymore. You look at them with the same neutral friendliness you'd extend to any acquaintance rather than with the intensity of someone still emotionally entangled. The moment of recognition triggers a cascade of psychological responses that the avoidant has spent their entire life avoiding. And these responses reveal just how much they actually valued what they consistently pushed away. The internal collapse when loss becomes real. The moment the avoidant realizes they've lost you permanently triggers an internal collapse that's unlike anything they've experienced during previous relationship endings. For most of the relationship, the avoidant operated from a position of control. They determined the distance, they decided when to engage and when to withdraw. They maintained the power to leave or stay, and this power felt safe. Even during breakups or separations, they maintained some sense of control because they knew you still cared, still wanted them, still held space for their return. But when they recognize you've genuinely moved on, that control evaporates entirely, and with it goes the psychological protection it provided. This internal collapse manifests first as shock that someone could actually let them go completely. The avoidant's entire defensive structure is built on the assumption that people will pursue them, will wait for them, will remain emotionally invested despite their unavailability. They've experienced this pattern repeatedly across relationships. They withdraw, their partner pursues. They return when ready, their partner accepts them back. This cycle has confirmed their worldview that they're desirable enough that people will tolerate their patterns, that their presence is valuable enough that people won't fully give up on them. Your complete release of them shatters this assumption. You're not pursuing, you're not waiting, you're not holding space. You've genuinely moved on. And this reality is incomprehensible to the avoidance framework for how relationships function. The collapse includes a flooding of emotions that the avoidant has been defending against throughout the relationship. During the relationship, they maintained enough distance to keep feelings manageable. They could care about you without feeling too much, could be present without being overwhelmed, could maintain attachment without vulnerability, but the permanent loss breaks through these defenses. Suddenly, they feel the full weight of what they've lost. The grief, the regret, the longing, the fear, the panic. All the emotions they've been keeping at bay through their withdrawal patterns crash through their psychological barriers all at once. This emotional flooding is terrifying for the avoidant because it's exactly what they've been trying to avoid their entire life. The internal collapse also involves the avoidant experiencing the abandonment they've been defending against since childhood. Their avoidant patterns developed as protection against being left, against being hurt, against depending on someone who might not be reliable. By maintaining distance, by never fully committing, by always keeping escape routes available, they've tried to ensure they can never be abandoned because they never allow themselves to be fully attached. But your permanent departure triggers the exact experience they've been trying to prevent. They're being left, they're being rejected. Someone who mattered to them is choosing to remove them from their life. And because they never let themselves fully feel their attachment to you during the relationship, the loss hits with devastating force when it becomes permanent. This collapse includes the avoidant confronting what they actually felt for you, feelings they minimized and compartmentalized throughout the relationship. When you were available, they could take your presence for granted, could focus on their discomfort with closeness, could emphasize what felt wrong rather than what felt right. But your permanent absence forces them to recognize what they had. The memories become more vivid now, your laughter, your understanding, the way you saw them clearly and loved them anyway, the patience you showed while they struggled with intimacy, the moments of genuine connection that existed beneath their withdrawal patterns. These memories, no longer colored by their anxiety about closeness, reveal the depth of what they've lost. The internal collapse also involves the avoidant sense of identity destabilizing. They've built their self-concept around being independent, not needing people too much, being able to walk away without devastating impact. But your permanent departure reveals that this identity was more defensive than authentic. They did need you more than they allowed themselves to acknowledge. They were more attached than they let themselves feel. They're more impacted by your absence than their self-concept allows for. This dissonance between who they believe they were and what they're actually experiencing creates profound identity confusion that forces them to question fundamental assumptions about themselves. The collapse includes panic about whether they're capable of genuine connection at all. If they pushed away someone who loved them, someone who was patient and understanding, someone who gave them space and time, then maybe the problem isn't that they haven't found the right person. Maybe the problem is them, their wounds, their limitations, their inability to sustain intimacy with anyone. This recognition that their patterns rather than their circumstances are the issue triggers existential dread about whether they're fundamentally broken, whether they're capable of the kind of partnership they actually want, whether they'll repeat these patterns forever, driving away anyone who gets close. The internal collapse is particularly devastating because the avoidant recognizes that you walking away permanently isn't about anger or hurt or revenge. Those motivations would actually be easier for them to process because it would mean you still cared enough to feel intensely about them. But your departure is about self-preservation, about choosing yourself, about recognizing that the relationship couldn't give you what you needed and making peace with that reality. This understanding that you didn't leave because you hate them, but because you love yourself more than you love the hope of them changing, is a different kind of loss. One that the avoidant has no framework for processing because it doesn't position them as a villain, but simply as someone you've outgrown. The desperate attempt to reverse what can't be undone. Once the initial shock and internal collapse begin, the avoidant typically enters a phase of desperate attempts to reverse the permanent loss, to somehow undo what's been done, to convince you to reconsider a decision you've already made peace with. These attempts reveal how profoundly the avoidant is impacted by your permanent departure because they're behaving in ways completely contrary to their usual patterns. The person who could barely maintain consistent communication during the relationship suddenly can't stop reaching out. The person who needed constant space suddenly can't tolerate your absence. The person who avoided vulnerability suddenly offers it freely, desperately, in ways that feel too little, too late. The desperate attempts often begin with increased contact that violates the boundaries you've established. The avoidant texts, calls, shows up unannounced, reaches out through mutual friends, monitors your social media obsessively, looking for openings to reconnect. This behavior is the opposite of how they function during the relationship, where you were the one pursuing and they were the one maintaining distance. The role reversal is stark and telling. What changed isn't that the avoidant suddenly developed capacity for pursuit. What changed is that you're no longer available, and the scarcity of access to you activated their attachment anxiety in ways your consistent availability never did. The attempts to reverse the loss include the avoidant suddenly offering everything you asked for during the relationship but never received. They're suddenly willing to commit, to be consistent, to communicate openly, to discuss the future, to integrate you into their life. They promise change, promise therapy, promise to address their patterns. They present a vision of the relationship you always wanted, the version of themselves they could have been if they'd done this work while you were still willing to wait for it. But these offers come too late, made from panic about loss rather than from genuine readiness for sustained change. And this timing reveals they're more about fear of abandonment than about actual transformation. The desperate attempts also include the avoidant expressing emotions they never showed during the relationship. They tell you they love you with an intensity they never demonstrated when you were together. They share vulnerable feelings they always kept hidden. They cry, they plead, they demonstrate emotional availability that was conspicuously absent during all the time you were asking for exactly this kind of presence. This sudden emotional availability can feel validating, proof that you weren't crazy for believing the connection was real, proof that they do care despite their patterns. But it's also frustrating because it reveals they had access to these emotions and this vulnerability all along, but chose not to share them until the consequence of losing you became real. The attempts to reverse the loss often include the avoidant trying to convince you that timing was the only issue, that if you just give them another chance, they'll be different now. They frame the relationship's failure as about circumstances or personal growth that needed to happen, rather than about the patterns they consistently chose during the time you were together. They suggest that they've changed in the days or weeks since you left, that they've had major realizations, that they've become the person who can meet your needs. But genuine transformation of attachment patterns takes months or years of consistent work, not the brief period since you made your departure final. The avoidant is offering different behavior motivated by panic, not sustainable change rooted in healed wounds. The desperate phase includes the avoidant attempting to negotiate, to bargain, to find some version of connection you'll accept. Even if it's not the full relationship, they offer friendship, offer to just talk sometimes, offer to be in your life in whatever capacity you'll allow. These offers reveal their inability to fully accept the loss, their hope that maintaining any thread of connection might eventually allow them to work their way back to relationship. But these partial connections typically serve the avoidance needs more than yours. They get to avoid the full grief of losing you while you remain unable to fully move on because you're still entangled with them. The attempts also include the avoidant presenting evidence that they're doing the work they should have done during the relationship. They tell you they've started therapy, that they're reading about attachment, that they're examining their patterns. They want you to know they're taking your concerns seriously now, addressing the issues that caused the relationship's end. But this work, necessary as it is, doesn't obligate you to return. The avoidance growth is their responsibility in their journey, and it doesn't erase the damage their patterns created, doesn't restore the trust that was eroded, doesn't guarantee they'll sustain the changes beyond the panic of losing you. The desperate attempts become more intense when they realize nothing is working, when every effort to reconnect meets with your firm boundaries or gentle disengagement. The avoidant might escalate to grand gestures, showing up at your home or workplace, enlisting mutual friends to advocate on their behalf, creating situations where you're forced to interact. This escalation reveals the depth of their panic, but also the limits of their understanding. They're still trying to control the outcome, still unable to respect your decision, still prioritizing their need for you over your clearly stated need for separation. The desperation phase eventually exhausts itself when the avoidant realizes that nothing they do reverses your decision, that you've genuinely moved on, that the door they're knocking on is not going to open. This recognition doesn't come easily. The avoidant cycles through the desperate attempts multiple times, trying different approaches, different angles, different emotional appeals. But eventually the reality settles in. You're not coming back. Not because you don't care what happens to them, but because you care more about your own well-being. Because you've learned that love without consistent partnership isn't enough. Because you've grown beyond the version of yourself that would accept their patterns. And this settling reality moves the avoidant into the next phase of their response to permanent loss. The psychological reckoning they can no longer avoid. Once the desperate attempts to reverse the loss have exhausted themselves and the avoidant fully accepts that you're not returning, they enter a phase of psychological reckoning that they've been avoiding their entire adult life. This reckoning is forced upon them by the permanence of your departure in ways that previous relationship endings never were. Because with previous endings, they could tell themselves stories that protected their ego and avoided deep self-examination. They could blame the other person for being too needy, too demanding, incompatible with their nature. They could tell themselves they were better off alone, their relationships weren't worth the discomfort. But your departure is different because of how you left, not in anger or hurt, but in clear-eyed recognition of incompatibility, not demanding they change, but simply choosing yourself when they couldn't meet your needs. This type of ending makes their usual defensive narratives impossible to maintain. The psychological reckoning begins with the avoidant being forced to confront their patterns as wounds rather than as personality traits or preferences. Throughout their life, they framed their avoidance as who they are, someone independent, someone who needs space, someone not built for conventional relationship structures. This framing protected them from having to examine the painful early experiences that created these patterns, from having to acknowledge that their attachment style is an adaptive response to childhood wounds rather than an immutable personality feature. But losing you permanently, especially losing you to their own patterns, makes it impossible to maintain this defensive framework. They can't tell themselves they're just independent when their independence cost them someone they valued. They can't frame their need for space as healthy when their patterns pushed away someone who was willing to give them space while also offering genuine partnership. The reckoning includes the avoidant reviewing the relationship through a new lens, seeing their behavior from your perspective in ways they couldn't, while they were focused on their own discomfort. They remember moments when you expressed hurt about their withdrawal, and they dismissed it, insisted you were too sensitive, told you that you needed too much. They recall times when you asked for consistency, and they framed your request as pressure, as attempts to control them, as incompatible with their need for autonomy. They revisit conversations where you explained what you needed from partnership, and they heard those needs as demands rather than as legitimate requirements for sustainable relationship. This review is painful because it reveals how thoroughly they minimized your experience, how consistently they prioritized their comfort over your needs, how completely they failed to show up as a partner even when you were patient and understanding. The psychological reckoning forces the avoidant to confront the impact of their patterns, not just on this relationship, but across their entire relational history. They begin to see the thread connecting all their previous relationship failures, the pattern of pursuing people until they get close, and then withdrawing when intimacy triggers their discomfort. They recognize that every relationship has ended the same way, with them creating distance, their partner eventually exhausting themselves, trying to maintain connection, the relationship dying from their emotional unavailability. This pattern recognition is devastating because it reveals that the problem isn't bad luck or incompatible partners. The problem is them, their wounds, their inability to sustain intimacy, even with people who love them well. The reckoning also involves the avoidant confronting their deep fear of vulnerability and how thoroughly this fear has controlled their life. They've spent years building walls, maintaining distance, protecting themselves from being hurt or controlled or abandoned. But these protective strategies have created exactly what they feared. They're alone, they've been left, they're experiencing the abandonment they've been trying to prevent through their avoidance. This recognition that their defenses failed to protect them and instead guaranteed the outcome they feared most is psychologically destabilizing. It forces them to question whether the vulnerability they've been avoiding could possibly be more painful than the isolation their avoidance has created. The psychological reckoning includes the avoidant facing their own capacity for cruelty, even if unintentional. They review moments when their withdrawal caused you pain, when their silence left you anxious and confused, when their inconsistency eroded your sense of security, They remember you asking for reassurance and them refusing to provide it, you expressing hurt and them becoming defensive, you needing presence and them offering absence. These memories force them to recognize that, regardless of their intentions, their patterns cause real damage to someone they cared about. This accountability is difficult for the avoidant because they've always positioned themselves as the one protecting their boundaries, the one being pressured, the one who needed space from overwhelming partners. Accepting their role as someone who caused harm requires dismantling this defensive identity. The reckoning forces the avoidant to confront what they've lost, specifically rather than in abstract terms. It's not just that they lost a relationship, they lost you, your particular laugh, your specific way of understanding them, your patience with their difficulties, your ability to see past their defenses to who they actually were beneath them. They lost the future you could have built together, the life you could have shared, the person they could have become through partnership with someone who genuinely loved them. This specific loss is harder to process than abstract relationship failure because it's about recognizing the irreplaceable nature of what they pushed away. Not just that they sabotaged another relationship, but that they sabotaged this relationship with you. The psychological reckoning also involves the avoidant facing the possibility that they might repeat these patterns forever, that they might be incapable of sustained intimacy, that they might end up alone because they can't overcome their wounds enough to maintain partnership. This existential fear about their own capacity for love and connection is profound. It's one thing to be alone by choice, confident in one's independence. It's entirely different to be alone because you've driven away everyone who got close, to recognize that your patterns guarantee isolation, to understand that unless something fundamental changes, you'll continue losing people you care about. This recognition can trigger either genuine commitment to healing or defensive retreat into cynicism about relationships. But either way, it's a reckoning that can't be avoided once it's begun. The reckoning includes the avoidant, recognizing that the timing of their realization is itself part of the pattern. They always recognize what they had after it's gone. They always develop capacity for pursuit after the person has stopped pursuing them. They always become willing to change after it's too late to save the relationship. This recognition that their awareness consistently arrives after the damage is irreversible is particularly painful because it suggests that loss is what activates their attachment system, that they can't appreciate what they have until it's gone. This pattern awareness forces them to question whether they're capable of valuing and maintaining connection while they have it, or whether they're doomed to only recognize value in retrospect. The permanent alteration of how they see themselves. The final and most profound impact of losing you permanently is the permanent alteration of how the avoidant sees themselves. A fundamental shift in self-concept that emerges from confronting their patterns and their consequences in ways they can no longer defend against or rationalize away. This alteration doesn't happen immediately. It develops gradually as the avoidant processes the loss, does or doesn't do the work of examining their attachment wounds, and eventually integrates this experience into their understanding of who they are. But once this shift occurs, the avoidant can never return to their previous self-concept, can never again maintain the defensive narratives that allowed them to avoid accountability for their patterns. The permanent alteration begins with the avoidant losing their ability to see themselves as the independent, self-sufficient person who doesn't really need close relationships. This identity has been central to their self-concept, the story they've told themselves about why they maintain distance, why they don't commit fully, why they resist vulnerability. But losing you reveals that this identity was more defensive than authentic. They did need you more than they allowed themselves to acknowledge. They were more dependent on the relationship than they let themselves feel. Your absence creates a void they can't fill through their independence. And this reality forces them to recognize that their self-sufficiency was always more about fear of dependency than about genuine contentment with solitude. The alteration includes the avoidant recognizing themselves as someone whose patterns cause harm, whose behavior has real impact on people they care about. They can no longer maintain the narrative that they're just someone who needs space, whose boundaries simply weren't compatible with certain partners. They have to acknowledge that their withdrawal creates pain, their inconsistency generates insecurity, their emotional unavailability damages the people who try to love them. This recognition of themselves as capable of causing harm, even unintentional harm, even harm that emerges from their own wounds, permanently changes how they move through relationships. They can't unknow the impact of their patterns, can't unsee the damage they create through their avoidance. The permanent alteration also involves the avoidance relationship to their own emotions fundamentally changing. Throughout their life, they've minimized feelings, maintained distance from their own emotional experience, prided themselves on rationality and control. But the loss of you breaks through these defenses, forcing them to feel with an intensity they've been avoiding their entire adult life. This experience of being overwhelmed by emotion, of grief and regret and longing that can't be rationalized away, permanently expands their emotional range. They can no longer maintain their previous relationship to feelings, can no longer stay as defended against their own experience, can no longer take pride in emotional control, now that they've felt how devastating it is when those controls fail. The alteration includes a shift in how the avoidant understands their relational history. They can no longer see their past relationships as a series of incompatibilities or bad matches. They recognize the through line of their own patterns destroying each connection, their own fears sabotaging each partnership, their own wounds preventing the intimacy they claimed they wanted. This recognition reframes their entire romantic history from a narrative about finding the right person to a narrative about needing to heal themselves. The common denominator across all their failed relationships isn't the partners they chose, but the patterns they brought to each relationship, and this understanding permanently shifts how they approach future connections. The permanent alteration also involves the avoidant developing awareness of their attachment triggers that they can never fully suppress again. They recognize what activates their withdrawal, increasing intimacy, expressions of need from their partner, future planning that implies commitment, moments when partnership requires them to prioritize relationship over autonomy. Having recognized these triggers, having seen how they operate, having watched how their response to these triggers cost them, they can no longer be unconscious about their patterns. They might still struggle with the same triggers, might still experience the urge to withdraw, but they can no longer tell themselves they don't know why they're pulling away or that their withdrawal is about their partner rather than about their own wounds. The alteration includes a fundamental shift in how the avoidant values potential future relationships. They can no longer take people's patience for granted, can no longer assume that someone willing to accommodate their patterns will wait indefinitely, can no longer believe that love alone will be sufficient if they can't show up consistently as a partner. They've learned through losing you that accommodation has limits, that eventually people choose themselves over hope for change, that being loved doesn't mean being waited for forever. This knowledge changes how they engage with future partners, either making them more cautious about entering relationships they're not ready for, or motivating them to address their wounds before those wounds destroy another connection. The permanent alteration also involves the avoidant carrying you as a reference point against which future connections are measured. You become the one who got away, the relationship that could have worked if they'd been capable of showing up, the person who understood them but ultimately chose themselves over waiting for them to heal. This position you occupy in their internal landscape is permanent. Even if they eventually have other relationships, even if they do the work and develop more secure attachment, you remain the loss that taught them the hardest lessons, the person whose permanent departure forced them to confront themselves in ways they'd been avoiding. Future partners might benefit from the growth your loss catalyzed, but they'll always exist somewhat in your shadow, measured against the connection the avoidant recognized too late. The alteration includes the avoidant developing capacity for regret that they've previously defended against. Throughout their life, they've minimized regret about relationship endings, told themselves things worked out as they should, maintained detachment about past partners. But with you, they can't maintain this detachment. They regret their patterns, regret not doing the work sooner, regret taking your patience for granted, regret all the moments they chose withdrawal over presence. This capacity for regret, once developed, can't be eliminated. It becomes part of how they process their choices, part of how they evaluate their behavior, part of the emotional landscape they navigate. The avoidant who previously moved through life, minimizing the impact of their choices, must now live with the weight of understanding how their patterns cost them something irreplaceable. The permanent alteration ultimately means the avoidant can never return to the defended, unconscious way they previously operated in relationships. They've been fundamentally changed by losing you, by being forced to confront their patterns, by experiencing the full weight of consequences they'd always managed to avoid before. This change doesn't guarantee they'll heal their wounds or develop secure attachment. Some avoidants respond to this reckoning by becoming more cynical, by withdrawing further from relationships, by convincing themselves they're better off alone rather than risking more loss. But even this retreat is different from their previous avoidance because it's a conscious choice informed by self-knowledge rather than an unconscious pattern operating beneath awareness. Other avoidants respond to the reckoning by finally committing to the deep work of healing their attachment wounds, motivated by the recognition that their patterns are unsustainable and will guarantee continued isolation unless addressed. But whether they retreat further or finally pursue healing, they can never unknow what losing you taught them about themselves, can never return to the defended ignorance that allowed them to repeat their patterns without confronting their impact, can never again maintain the identity of someone whose independence is strength rather than defense, whose boundaries are healthy rather than wounds, whose patterns are preferences rather than the psychological architecture that ensures they'll remain alone because intimacy feels more threatening than isolation, because vulnerability seems more dangerous than the guaranteed loneliness their avoidance creates.